All right, hello. This is just going to be a real short video for our composition this week. Just wanted to take a look at a couple scores, make a couple points that might be useful to all of you as you are finalizing your scores. Um, Remember that the deadline is the last day in September. That is officially less than a week away. So we are really getting there and should be in the final phases of this piece. I'm meeting with everybody this week to talk more individually, but I just want to say a couple things briefly about sort of notation in general. This is Ligoti's second string quartet, which I like to look at for notation because it's just so notationally rich. And everybody, you develop a style of notation as you write more, just like you develop a style of the kind of pitch language you use or other elements of music, and the way you handle scores and notation is no different. So Ligeti has a very particular style, but I just think it's instructive. You'll notice a lot of expressive text and just a lot of text in general. I'm gonna and he uses a lot of traditional text. Prestissimo, he's using sort of traditional Italian words, impetuoso, accelerando molto, right? So he uses that sort of set of Italian terms that brings a certain sense of a kind of a classical sensibility. He also, you'll notice, uses English and German for sort of more straightforward advice. Ligeti is Hungarian, but like a lot of Hungarian composers from the middle of last century fled Hungary and ended up living in Paris and other places, so speaks lots of languages, and you see it. But attack imperceptibly, and that's a little less stylized, just of sort of being very clear. So you'll notice just as I scroll through here, there's a ton of text everywhere. Cantabile, meno presto. So sort of traditional Italian musical terms, molto capriccioso con eleganza, right? As well as some more straightforward directions. And a fair amount of personality here. Tutta la forza vi verrucht, as though crazy. Altalone, heavy bouncing bow. So he's also going out there and saying as though crazy. Those are kind of more little whimsical verbiage that some people get really into using that kind of language. I try to not use words at all in my scores, for instance, and that's just kind of my style. But saying as though crazy is incredibly, gives the performers a much stronger idea than if it didn't. That really says you can kind of go nuts here. And that's paired with a technique, heavy bouncing bow, which implies a kind of aggressiveness, and it's paired with an extreme dynamic, an almost ridiculously extreme dynamic for fortes. And that's one thing Ligeti does, is he likes extremes. Let me move to the second movement. It's my favorite example of this. G sharp, G sharp, G sharp, G sharp. Everybody's playing a G sharp. This is just G sharps for this first line. And look at all the detail that's going into this G sharp. He's telling you what string it's on. He's telling you what bowing to use. He's giving you a strong, extreme dynamic. He's saying attack imperceptibly, sempre, always. He's saying flautando, or he's changing the sort of bow area and pressure. senza vibrato, no vibrato, right? There's like 18 different notational things here saying this is really quiet and really flat, and the changes that are going to be happening here are timbral. That pitch has got to be like a tiny little laser, and all of these shifts are going to happen by moving strings, by changing the placement of the bow, by moving from harmonics to arco, etc. So it's very clear what's being kept still here and then what's being manipulated. And as a performer, you can't help but get into that world of like, okay, this is this barely moving quiet thing, and then I'm going to really adjust my ears to working within this very fine-tuned timbral place. So what I want to suggest to you is many of you have places in your music that have some kind of simplicity, some kind of stability. It may not be as extreme as just being one single pitch, but you'll have stretches of your short pieces that have that same kind of stability. Maybe it is very stable pitch-wise, or maybe there's a rhythmic pattern that's very stable. There's some dimension that's incredibly stable. And in those dimensions, that opens up the possibility to stretch. Sorry, and in those places, it opens up the possibility to stretch other dimensions. So when the pitch is this fixed, the timbre can be wild, right? And if the rhythm is incredibly fixed, the pitch can be wild, for example, right? So you can, it's a balancing act. And that's what you see going on here. And that's going to be true in all of your pieces. You will have points where there is, you maybe have it could be just a couple notes or a couple bars, where it's just a held note maybe. Those are always opportunities to make them, if you want, as rich and complicated as this example here, even though it's just one pitch. Okay, that's just a general thought. Obviously, this is a string quartet that's working on a totally different scale, but the lesson is applicable. If you have something fixed, if you have something stable, you can create instability elsewhere and balance it. This I love. Notice how this page, there's nothing. There's no text at all. There's been all these instructions about really finely tuning this tiny timbre place. And then we get up here and it's just running. All he says here is, yeah, he just kind of says go, senza vibrato. So it's just kind of like thrown into the static place all of a sudden with nothing. And that's a useful lesson too, right? Saying nothing at all can sometimes be just as telling as saying a lot. And so all of that control, all of that sort of way our attention was drawn into this tiny timbral area is now like been opened up. And you'll hear that in a recording. You'll hear that sort of freedom in the sound. Okay, it comes through. It's subtle, but you can hear it. And you can see, I mean, talk about extreme. Look at these dynamics. And Ligeti also likes to do these asterisks where he's describing everything in a couple different languages. This is not something you'd want to do. This is way too difficult to read. He gets away with it, but you do not want to have 4, 5, 6 asterisks. It's crazy. There's more elegant ways to do that. But look at the extremes. Not sforzando, whatever it is, three Fs, and these tiny little shaping. I mean, this is so brief. This moment is so brief up here. And there is a shape to it, quite a profound shape that explodes, right? So shaping every little moment is possible. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but it's possible. Um, here's another great example where all of a sudden there's a lot less text. And the text that is applied as a sort of to everyone at once. Obviously, we're just writing for one voice, but it's worth showing again the sort of principle is always educational. Everything is sort of applied at once. That tells us this is a unit. This is one sound mass that's happening. Furthermore, what he's making us focus on are these rhythmic subdivisions and how they're overlapping. That's all that's there. There's not all of this stuff about timbral stuff. There's not all this bowing information. There's this clarity of like, the main thing here is rhythm, right? And Ligeti is very clear and extreme with what is going on in his piece at any given moment. Right now, these are about overlapping, sort of crazy sounding, chaotic divisions of 11 and 12 and 10, at 7 and 6. And to make that come to the foreground, all of that timbral stuff has to recede to the background. And then, of course, it changes. Again, extremes. Lots of extremes. Good. Thought I could look at a couple scores by my teacher in my undergrad, Suzanne Farron. This is a piece for clarinet solo. And you can see, look at all the space she gives just on the page, separating these lines. This is a good practice, right? It allows you to fit text in. Also, sometimes I think we can make things a little smaller than a sort of smaller font than you might think. Sometimes the difference between a sort of amateurish looking score and a more professional looking score is the amateur scores are sort of like big note heads, and sometimes like knocking the sort of size of everything down a couple clicks on the page makes it a little clearer. Again, look at all of this shaping, dynamic shaping. And this doesn't give you specific dynamics, but it's telling you you're going to sort of ebb and flow in this way. and the absence of it in these parts, which are instead of accents. Right? So we have these phrase markings, these lyrical sections. These are going to sort of ebb and flow. These accents, it's the rhythmic stuff that's the main thing. It's the articulation. These long tremolos, these are going to be dynamically shaped. These accents are going to be rhythmic and crisp. Again. And part of that comes from the pitch simplicity. There's a lot of staying basically around one pitch here, and that means those dynamics can really be more easily focused on as a shape in themselves. And oftentimes here it looks like it's really just kind of highlighting the shape of the phrase itself. This is very speech-like, actually. Da 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 dee da da dee da da dee dee da dee da 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 dee da. I bet you anything this is based on Italian. Knowing Suzanne, I bet this is mirroring an Italian text. Ba dee da dee da. A lot of her pieces are based on Italian. Petrarch. Petrarca. Recitativo. Molto rubato. Okay. All this shaping. Um, oh yes, one other thing I wanted to mention on the Ligeti, I was talking about that extremeness, and that those extremities can be important because they're clear. They tell the performer what you really want. I want this really loud. I want it 3 fortes. I want it with down bow. I want it with accent. I want it furious, brutal, tumultuous, right? How many more ways can I tell you? I want this really loud. I want it aggressive, right? 18 different ways of telling you this extreme thing. That means the string quartet is going to attack the beginning of this bar. There's just no way to get around it. You can't ignore it. And that's a good lesson to learn. Because that'll come across to the listener too. They won't be able to ignore that this has a character. And that's really important, of making sure your music is never just being kind of like, who knows what it is. Right? If it's going to be ambiguous, it should be ambiguous. You don't want it to just be kind of apathetic. You want the listener to be able to feel its identity at any given moment. And one way to do that is to have this sort of extreme clarity in dynamic, tempo, expressive markings. However, the voice is its own instrument, and every instrument is its own instrument, of course. And I talked about this with a couple of people the other day, but I'll mention it to everyone. There's something different about, you always have to worry about hurting an instrument. You can't be too rough with it, and that's especially true for the voice. And so there's a kind of a dynamic curve, I think, to the voice that's different from, say, a string instrument, where the ability for a singer to sing incredibly loud, that's a taxing thing, both in terms of breath and in terms of just being able to do it in a safe way for your voice. And so there's kind of like less control, we might say, in that louder forte, fortissimo area. You can't have the same nuance in that area. Contrastively, the quiet end of the spectrum in the voice is incredibly nuanced, and you can get so quiet with your voice. You can get so quiet, and you can get slightly louder, and you can get a little louder than that. And there's this amazing depth between pianissimo, between silence and mezzo piano. And so I would, if you are going to be extreme in your dynamics, if you want something quiet, I would use that lower dynamic range. Or if you want something really loud, I would lower everything else into that deeper quiet range, and then have the forte be the thing that really sticks out, as opposed to having the sort of bass line be mezzo piano and then having a triple forte, if that makes sense, right? So use one thing that you can do with the voice that I think can be particularly beautiful is use that really quiet range if you want to create dynamic extremes. Don't just start with piano. There's a lot less than that. And especially if we're doing a recorded thing, there's the potential to even do quiet that's up close versus louder that's farther away. And that creates a whole other timbral dimension. Anyways, I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to some notational things, give you this idea of using extremes to be really clear, give you this idea of sometimes stepping away to let the music sort of speak for itself, as it does in this section, and to sort of give a little more freedom away at points where that's necessary. I wanted to show you how much dynamic shaping you can do and phrasing you can do. I wanted to show you how much this idea of balance, that when one thing is really simple, it allows other stuff to get complex. If you've got one pitch, you can balance that out with a whole world of timbral and rhythmic changes which are quite sophisticated. Okay, so you can look for those moments. This is a big piece and those moments are stretched out. In your piece it might just be a bar. It might just be the pitch that sustains for a bar. You can enter into a timbral world in that bar if you want. So just some thoughts. Let me know, continue to let me know if you have any questions. We should be sending scores just as is, that they're all in fine shape, to Quince this week, and then Wednesday is the day. That's the due date. So we're getting there. We're almost there. You're all doing great. Awesome. Goodbye.